Picture lush rolling hills, scenic landscapes, a lake at every corner, and some of the most miserable winters you can possibly imagine. Most likely two areas come to mind: the Scandinavian Peninsula in Europe, a land full of ancient history and culture, and their American counterpart, an area dubbed by myself and a few independent sources as Scandimerica, spanning the Midwestern American states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, and more. The similarities are truly remarkable, although it is curious as to how a region that, for all intents and purposes, is in the middle of nowhere, located in the heartland of a continent that Scandinavians did wish to conquer and explore 1,000 years ago, become the area with the largest number and percentage of people of Scandinavian ancestry on the planet outside of their homeland, with ethnic enclaves of literally every Nordic identity, from the Finns to even those of Icelandic descent. So how and why did the Nordic peoples manage to move from one cold yet beautiful land on the fringes of European society to another frigid yet beautiful land on the fringes of American society? The beginning of Scandinavian history in the Americas can be traced back over a millennium ago to when the Norse Vikings from the western coast of Norway landed in Iceland and by proxy also explored the neighboring mammoth of an island that is Greenland. And even if you don't really consider Greenland to be part of North America, it has been proven over the years that the Vikings even traveled as far as Newfoundland and other parts of northern Canada. The Norse Greenlanders traded with and often clashed with the Inuit peoples known to them as Skraelings, although in the end it was the harsh winters and barren landscape of Greenland which caused the population to quickly dwindle and eventually die off completely. But that's not really what we're talking about now, is it? The region of Scandinavia at its core includes the countries of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, but often is expanded to include Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Finland, a group that actually belongs to an entirely different ethno-linguistic bloc, and the last time this region was united in any capacity was the Kalmar Union from the 14th to 16th centuries, but the union would end up being divided between Norway and Denmark to the west, and Sweden and Finland in the east. Denmark and Sweden were pretty eager to get in the game of global colonization and crafted the modest colonies of the Danish Virgin Islands and New Sweden in North America, with New Sweden being the more relevant of the two, located along the Delaware River in the northeast, and small numbers of colonists settled in this area in the 17th century. There was also a small number of ethnic Finns that settled in the region as well, because Finland was under Swedish rule during this time, and indeed during the twilight years of colonial rule in New Sweden, ethnic Finns made up over 50% of the population directly before annexation by the British and incorporation into America. According to contemporary estimates from demographers, there were around 2,000 to 4,000 Americans of Swedish descent by the time of American independence, less than 0.1% of the population, and it's safe to assume the majority of these Swedish Americans were not descended from settlers from New Sweden, but rather more recent immigrants. So it's safe to say that this colony didn't have a huge demographic impact on the US, and it wasn't until the mid-19th century that immigration would really begin to pick up, not in the former Swedish colony, but in the heartland of America. Now, back in my video on German Americans and how the Midwest of America essentially became a German ethno-state since the 19th century, I very briefly mentioned how parts of this region also contained pockets of Norwegian, Swedish, Dutch, and other Germanic immigrant groups, but I certainly didn't give the true scope of the situation. In some very large chunks of the Midwest, Scandinavian groups were numerically equivalent to, if not greater than, the Germans, Anglos, and or Native American groups they had displaced. The Scandinavians didn't necessarily choose this region because other Germanic peoples already lived there, but no doubt a similar culture and religion, that being Lutheranism, helped in having more cohesive communities, and over time the many Scandinavian groups settled together and near to each other, as well as throughout the country as a whole. But because this region was already heavily depopulated, Scandinavians were a much higher proportion of the population. The largest concentration of Norwegians is along the Canadian border, stretching from western Minnesota to North Dakota, while the majority Swedish territory lies mostly in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Although fewer in numbers than other groups, there are ethnic enclaves of Icelandic individuals in parts of North Dakota, but especially Manitoba near Lake Winnipeg, and the majority of Finnish Americans are located in the upper peninsula of Michigan, and just generally in the vicinity of Lake Superior. Danish Americans are one of the few groups that do not have a high concentration in Scandimerica, instead being more spread out across the western United States, but with the highest percentage in Utah, as we briefly discussed last video. Now, during this mass exodus of Scandinavians and other Germanic peoples headed for the Midwest, were Anglo-Americans opposed to the quickly changing demographics of their country? No doubt many were, yes, but over time these groups gradually assimilated into mainstream American culture, quickly losing a sense of their previous national heritage in only a couple of generations or so, although some groups like the Finns did take longer to assimilate than others due to the bigger cultural gap. As of 2014, around 160,000 Americans and 40,000 Canadians still speak a Scandinavian language at home, which is certainly quite a high number, but this is still barely 1% of the community as a whole, and the overwhelming majority of monolingual Scandinavian speakers are over the age of 60 or were not born in the country. Hence, their numbers are dropping rapidly, and the Scandinavian languages are moribund in the US, as there's really no advantage in learning the language of your ancestors in modern America, although it is true that the Scandinavian languages have greatly impacted certain English dialects spoken in the upper Midwest. Today in North America, those of full or partial Scandinavian ancestry number over 12 million people, compared to around 50 million for those of German ancestry, making up around 4% of the population of both Canada and the United States. This includes 5.1 million Norwegians, almost equivalent to the population of Norway itself, 4.7 million Swedes, 1.7 million Danes, 150,000 Icelanders, 800,000 Finns, and even a few tens of thousands of Sami, Scandinavia's oldest ethnic group who belong to the same Finno-Ugric ethno-macro group as the Finnish, yet retain a completely distinct language and culture. Many Sami came to Alaska in the 20th century to teach reindeer herding to the native Inuit, and many stayed in the United States afterwards, although there aren't any Sami towns that were established in the same manner as other Scandinavian ethnic groups. The highest percentage of Scandinavians in North America, other than Greenland, which is still a Danish territory, are North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, Utah, and many other states and provinces in the western half of the continent, while the South and the Northeast are mostly untouched. Now, I know the same thing is on everybody's mind. Did any of those Swedes bring that socialism over from Europe? In all seriousness, the modern Nordic countries do distinguish themselves as the so-called progressive capital of the world, being some of the most secular, socialized, tolerant countries out there, and this has brought them some great advantages as well as great detriment. From what I can gather, the move towards irreligion in Scandinavia started even before the end of the 19th century, although it wasn't until the 1960s that the church really started to lose influence in these countries. So most historic Scandinavian immigrants were Christians, just as most other European immigrants, and to this day the majority of ethnic Scandinavians in North America are Lutheran, with smaller minorities of Catholics, Mormons, and other Protestant groups. Despite the stereotype that Northerners are incredibly secular, there is actually evidence that some parts of Minnesota and North Dakota are far more religious than the surrounding region, perhaps even more so than Mississippi, Alabama, and other regions of the Deep South. The majority of all Scandinavian Americans and Canadians are adherents of the Lutheran Church, often merging with other Lutheran congregations belonging to ethnic Germans in the area, and weekly church attendance sits somewhere around 30 to 40%, quite a striking contrast when compared to the 5 to 10% seen across Norway or Sweden. As for politics, it is true that in the early 1900s, American socialist Eugene V. Debs did enjoy a decent amount of support in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, but this is most likely simply due to the disgruntled factory workers in the region, as the Swedish Social Democratic Party didn't take off until the 1920s. Up until very recently, however, this region was one of the very few rural locations that predominantly voted Democrat, but not so much anymore. In today's America, Scandinavian Americans are more or less culturally, politically, and economically indistinguishable from white Americans as a whole, with similar voting patterns on average. However, one interesting coincidence between Scandinavia and this region of Scandimerica is the migration patterns of certain immigrant groups, such as Polish people and other Slavs, who also have a high concentration in the region and are beginning to have a much larger presence in Scandinavia back in Europe. And Scandinavia is also known for having the largest Somali population outside of Africa, and Minnesota also has the largest population of Somalis in North America. So it looks like the descendants of the Vikings really did take over a large chunk of North America after all, making their extinct Greenlandic cousins beam from pride from beyond the grave. Similar to my video on German America, I designed a flag to represent Scandimerica and the whole of Scandinavian Americans, even though I don't have any connection to this group in particular. The 16 stripes on the flag represent the 4 Norse countries of mainland Europe, because of course 4 squared is 16, and each Nordic flag contains 2 perfect squares in the top and bottom left corners, while the 200 stars, in lieu of the original Nordic cross, are representative of the, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I didn't really think this one out too much. But hey, I do as I please. So this region of Scandimerica, the heartland of the United States and Canada, certainly sticks out from any other place in North America, although we did discuss some very diverse topics in this video, and I didn't quite get to discuss all aspects of this community or region. Please let me know your thoughts on Scandinavian Americans of all kinds, their ancient history which stretches back 1,000 years, and the current region where they still maintain a majority or plurality of the population, and for today's poll, let me know which ethnic Scandinavian bloc in North America has the most interesting history or modern community in your opinion. As always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching everyone. Jag ses nästa gång.